This episode contains descriptions of gratuitous violence. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to episode 9 of the Liminal Space podcast. This is Tristan.
This is Rashid.
And today we're going to be talking about a couple of different themes. One is a trigger warning. There will be some Christian stuff. but cool stuff. And then we're also quite interested in this question about fantasy. And Rashid, you had a question you've been thinking about around that.
Yes, to be honest, I've kind of been sitting with it since season 1, episode 1, where we had that intro poem and we were discussing fantasy worlds and perhaps even escaping to fantasy worlds, but wondering if it's even possible for us to do that where we remain in our bodies. For me, as someone who's always loved fantasy and different lands that authors create and those kind of things, as I've become more perhaps conscious that I'm living in a body on a planet where there's fellow humans, and I guess I'm wanting to walk in love towards those fellow humans, I'm wrestling with this question of, is it helpful for me to escape to other worlds? I think there's actually something helpful and valuable there. Almost this idea of escaping, but remaining in my body and staying in my body and having that expand my imagination towards a better world on on this earth that exists. So we have a super cool guest who we're going to dig into various ideas like that with.
Yeah, so we have Nicole Joshua with us today. And Nicole is a wife to one husband and a mother to one child. She's a theologian, a home executive, and is currently on a journey of discernment towards ordination in the Christian tradition. She has a deep thirst for knowledge, evidenced by her formal studies in accounting, theology, particularly biblical studies, and a voracious appetite for reading, and loves sharing what she is learning with others. Nicole is also a teacher at heart, having taught biblical studies at Cornerstone Institute, through involvement in Christian education in the faith communities where she had worshipped, and is currently enjoying many opportunities to preach in a church. Nicole has a passion for teaching about the Bible. Through her appreciation for the complexity and beauty of biblical texts, she aims to invite others to gain new and sometimes deeply challenging insights into their understanding of the God revealed in the biblical text. She believes that the text of Scripture not only carries the capacity to transform individual lives, but also has the capacity to call the faith community to creatively live out their faith in the world in ways that bring about social transformation. She hopes to inspire followers of Jesus towards joining God in God's work of bringing shalom into the world. So welcome, Nicole.
Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to have you.
It's super cool to have you as our first guest for season 2.
No pressure.
Yeah. No pressure. It's
No
not
pressure. You're just setting the standard for the rest of the
Yeah.
But Nicole, we've been friends for a while, and students together and colleagues even, I think. But maybe to start with, we're recording from Alphendale in Cape Town, which I didn't know was a suburb. Could you tell us how you came to be here and why you choose to live here?
Okay. So 10 years ago, Francisco and I finally came to an agreement that we were ready to become parents. And because of my infertility challenges, that meant that we were going the adoption route. But we needed a bigger house. We lived in quite a tiny space on the right side of the railway line in Deep River. And the house was just too small.
Yeah.
And so for us, it wasn't actually so much the area. We recognized that to be on a certain side of a railway line meant you'd probably pay $1 million to $1.5 million more than houses on the other side of the railway line. And you could probably get the same size property for much less. And that is exactly what this property represented. And so it really wasn't a case of that we wanted to live in Upper Heathfield or Alphendale.
Or Lower Bergfleet.
Or
some
Lower
people
Bergfleet.
want.
No, this wouldn't be Lower Deep River.
Yeah. As long as the rates were affordable. But that's really how we came to be in this house.
Yeah.
And did you grow up in Cape Town?
I did.
Okay.
Bellville South.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yes, which has an interesting story, by the way. I found out in my later years that Bellville South was one of the few suburbs in Cape Town that was supposed to be allocated as a white suburb, But the coloured intellectuals that lived in Bellville South actually fought a legal battle to have Bellville South classified as a coloured community.
Wow.
And so the white people had to leave.
Wow.
So they
that's
actually
crazy.
won. The coloured intellectuals
Yes,
won.
they did.
And
And my aunt's dad was one of the people that was part of the legal team that fought the government to have Bellville South classified as a coloured community.
Crazy.
wow. Well, that's already interesting.
Yes.
So tell us about, at the moment in your life, what are some stories or a story that grounds you, that you use to navigate the world
Yeah.
or shapes your view of the world?
When you had first mentioned that and we had sat for our prep interview, I thought I understood the question. And then when you sent out an outline as to what we were going to chat about today, I actually realized that I couldn't pinpoint one story. I was like, is it Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Or is it Red Riding Hood? Like, what is, if somebody had to ask me what the story was, I couldn't actually think of it. So the closest that I could get to it was, I suppose there are particular themes that are grounding me. But then as we chatted a bit about it, I actually realized that at the end of the day, I actually am grounded in a story, and it's my understanding of the biblical story. It's a very particular understanding of the biblical story. I had recently found myself at a meeting with fellow Christians or fellow people who profess to be Christians. And I actually realized that we weren't coming from the same perspective. And that is why when I say what is grounding me at the moment is, I can't say the biblical story. I can say a biblical story that has been shaped over many years of studying and reflection. And the themes in that story, which might be helpful, is the theme of hope, but it's not a commercialized or sort of a forced happiness hope. It's a hard one hope. It's a hope where your fingernails are broken from crawling on the ground. There's a lot of sweat and there's a lot of tears that went into it. But what keeps you moving is this deep, deep belief that there's something better ahead. And my understanding of that something better is a particular understanding of the resurrection. That somehow life has shown that death doesn't have the final say. That something beautiful can come from death. And so even though there's so much death in the world right now, and so much darkness and so much destruction, I believe that out of that something good can come, something beautiful can come. And so that fuels my hope to keep going day by day.
So you spoke about hope and deep hope as a concept. Some people would say maybe we're going to the fantasy conversation now. Like, that's wishful thinking, that things are going to change and could get better. How do you deal with that?
In 2014, I had the privilege of visiting Rwanda. 2014, they were commemorating the 20th anniversary of the genocide that had occurred in Rwanda in 1994. And part of the conversations that were happening in that country was whether or not they would maintain the monuments that they had basically created out of the horror that had happened in 1994. There was a feeling that they now needed to move on as a country, and they felt that maintaining those monuments would be problematic because
like
people wouldn't be
memorial?
able to. Correct. It was more, a memorial. So obviously there's the Holocaust Museum within Kigali, and if I'm not mistaken, like 120,000 people are actually buried at the Holocaust Museum in Kigali. So we visited the museum, and then we went to a community called Nyamata. In Nyamata, there's another memorial there. It's the original Catholic Church. And it's a building that has been kept as it was back then. There's a guide that meets you at the gate of the church, And then they lead you in and they begin to tell you the story. You get to the church doors, and the church doors have slashes in them and holes. And so you get told that it's the machetes, the slashing of the machetes and bullet holes in the doors. You walk into the building and everything still looks like it had been through a war. As you walk into the church building, there are benches that have piles of clothing that have basically been folded neatly and stacked on each other. That is the clothing of the people that were murdered in the church. The altar has been wiped down, but the bloodstains are all over the altar. The bloodstains are all over the baptismal font. And then as you get into the main part of the church, the tour guide, she tells us of how the Hutu rebels basically took all the babies and threw them against the walls to smash their skulls. And then you are led outside, and as you go around the corner, there's the plaque of the nun who used to be in charge of the Catholic Church, I think. And what many people don't know is that in the history leading up to 1994, there had been sporadic uprisings of Hutus against Tutsis. And so what would happen was that the Catholic Church the buildings would become sanctuary buildings. And so the Tutsis would know that they could run to be given sanctuary in the Catholic churches. And in one of the uprisings just before the 1994 genocide, she had actually contacted the French government to explain what was going on there and to ask for assistance. And then she was subsequently murdered. And so that plaque, I think, is where she was buried. And then you go past that, and then you have these huge, they look like the roofs of a building, and they are two long buildings, and then there are staircases that go down. And on the top of the buildings, there are these floral arrangements, but they're the silk flowers. You go down into the one section. On the left-hand side of the wall, there are just boxes, and those boxes are filled with the bones. So there's about 50,000 people that were killed in and around that church area, and they are all buried in these two buildings. And so the boxes contain 10 people each. That's on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, there's a corridor, and it's got shelves, and it's got skeletons of people, but the bones have been separated. So you've got skulls, then you've got arm bones, and then you've got leg bones or whatever. And they are packed in size order. So the deeper you go in, the smaller the bones become. And those are the bones of people that they couldn't identify. And so hence the bones are there. And the other people who could be identified are in the coffins. So we come out of the building, and I'm struggling to breathe. In my mind, I'm like, God, how could you allow this to happen here? I asked the tour guide who were the bouquets from, and she explained that the surviving families members had actually had these bouquets made for their families. And she said, oh, and that's my family's bouquet right there. So I looked at her, and I was like, your family is buried here? She says, yes, my entire family except my sister and I survived. And she's this beautiful woman. She wore this bright cerise dress, and she was hugely pregnant, right? So she walks out of the shaded area and she walks into the sun, and I'm sitting there in complete despair and horror at what I just seen, what I just heard. And at one moment, I looked up and I looked at this woman. I went over to her and I asked her quietly, so when is baby due? And she said, I'm 7 months pregnant and baby's due in 2 months' time, and this is my second one. And this thought just came through my head that I'm standing in a place surrounded by death. And I've been taken through this place by a survivor of that horror. But here she stands with a baby growing in her tummy.
Life, sure.
And I was just like, that voice just came into my head that said, death will not have the final say. Here is this woman celebrating life. She's got another daughter. She showed me a photograph of a daughter. She's carrying this baby, and there was just her entire life just shouted hope. And that is the first time that I experienced what I mean by deep hope. It's like, it's a hope that like grabs you in your gut and it doesn't let go. As much as you intellectualize it or rationalize it, it's the stubborn belief. That picture of that woman with the cerise dress standing in the sunlight, surrounded by death, is how I hold on to hope and how I understand resurrection.
Thank you for sharing that story. That is so good and so beautiful. Sure. That's so amazing. And we have this idea, this concept that we speak about, this glimmers and gaps in reality, where you're looking at something and you're saying the reality is just showing me death. This is just death upon death upon death. And then there's just this little gap in reality, this glimmer that just shows, oh wait, there could be something else. At the end of the last season, we were like, but what can we define these gaps in reality as, that we have every now and then in different circumstances in our lives or in society? And I'm not sure if it was Tristan, if it was you or I, and one of us said that one way of describing them is hope, using hope as like that descriptive thing. And perhaps now, because you also mentioned it, perhaps in a Christian context, this idea of resurrection, that resurrection hope as well. And because the thing about that, it sounds so lame even coming out of my mouth, because that gets so like, that resurrection hope gets, and stuff like that, like different themes and concept, they get so used and abused, and they get employed for violence, like on so many occasions. So it will be like a certain country is going to war, and they're like, yeah, God goes before us, God fights our battles, and we have the hope of the resurrection. To what? For genocide? For murder? Like, what are we talking about, you know?
There seems to be this like recurring thing about, even in deep hope, there's the real material concreteness to it. Not a airy theory, or when we spoke to Ashley and Aliane, there was the concept of hokey hope, they would say, which is like just this kind of ethereal kind of thing. What I'm thinking about is this balance between like the material on the ground type things, evidences of hope and love and things like that. But at the same time, there is the idea of like conjuring up what the future might look like is still something that's a bit, I don't want to say airy, but it's not concrete yet.
Ephemeral.
So, and I know that you're a fan of fantasy, and so is Rashid.
Yeah.
And I think often people who are into that stuff get accused of being in their head. It's like dreamy. I'm a dreamy person. I dream about things. And sometimes it's like, wow, that doesn't really result in anything. But I'm wondering about the possibilities of that opens up even these ideas. Can fantasy play a role in that?
Are you waiting for me to answer first, or are you wanting Rashid to?
Whoever can answer.
Yeah. No, we deal in questions, not in answers. Yeah. So we're more interested in the question. Perhaps as a starting point, Nicole, if you could maybe just share a bit about fantasy and its reading here specifically that you love.
So one of my first memories of visiting my local library was walking in, greeting the librarian because we were family friends, and then walking to a very particular section of the library. And there were shelves, and it had the myths and legends of the different countries. And I would take however many books I could take out, and I would just read, and I loved stories about fairies and dragons and magic. And at the time I didn't analyze it. It just brought me joy. I just loved it. But as I'm thinking about it now, none of the fantasy books that I've ever read was airy-fairy. It was all gritty. Hard-won victories, character-building journeys, blood and sweat and tears. But there's this beautiful thing about the possibility of being able to create something because of a thought, because of a word, because of the wave of a magic wand, like whatever it was. But also, like, the magic was never just something that was there. It was always, there's a responsibility with magic, like magic is like electricity. It's a power that exists. So depending on how the user uses it, gives it its connotation as to whether it is bad or good. But it is neither as it exists. And so if I'm just thinking about the novels that I've been reading lately, in there, you don't use the magic lightly. You know, I know when I started reading fantasy, my family, I didn't have an easy child. I had a privileged childhood in the sense that I always lived in a home, sturdy walls, roof over the heads, windows that weren't broken, and I ate every day. Yeah. I never went one day without a meal. I had clothes that fit me. I had clean clothes that fit me. We had access to electricity, to water. I had a VHS, video machine, so I could watch television.
You're giving away your age.
I grew up privileged, but emotionally and psychologically, there was a lot of stuff that was going on. And so fantasy was a place that I did escape to. But I escaped in Nancy Drew novels. And Nancy Drew novels wouldn't necessarily be classified. I loved the idea that it was some place that I didn't recognize.
Yeah.
So geographically, it could take me out of where I was embodied.
You need a map there.
Yeah.
When you're in it,
there was a
map.
And the places' names I could barely
like
pronounce.
Cool stuff,
and all the names were like totally created names. Like it wasn't earth names, it wasn't Christian names or Muslim names or Hindu names. It was just like these vowels and syllables that were put, and consonants that were put together. But there was always this thing about loyalty and friendship. Like those were the themes that were always there. Like I could keep on going because I had somebody with me. So Frodo had Sam, and even when Frodo wanted to give up, Sam spoke those words of wisdom. Even Teddy Brooks, like in the Shannara series, I mean, those were not, like I wouldn't read those stories to my daughter. It's not like airy-fairy stuff. It was like real life experiences that were transported into a context that felt safer for me. So it was like, because it was externalized, I could engage in the turmoil that the characters went through, the political upheavals, the empire changes. I felt okay with it because it was separate from me. So that was how I escaped from where I was. But it's not real escapism.
Yes.
Because when you read those stories, what kept me, I think, reading them was that, yes, they triumph. They did. Good did overcome evil, but at a huge cost.
I'm thinking about what you said. Sorry, Tristan, we're gonna geek out for a moment. Yeah,
don't worry, I'll just go on my phone.
The fantasy talk. What you were speaking about earlier about magic and that kind of thing. Like, okay, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, so because you mentioned Frodo and Sam, we're gonna go there. But I was thinking about, like, even in the Lord of the Rings as an example, not everyone can do magic. In fact, it's very few would be like Gandalf and Saruman, for example, and maybe a handful of others. But that's an example of like two wizards, equally powerful beings, but one uses the power that he's been granted. Saruman for essentially for evil and to create more power for himself and for death and destruction. The other one, who has just as much power, if not even more power, uses that power for service. He like almost humbles himself. So when we meet Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings, people look at him and they think they call him like the vagabond, and they think, oh, he's just that guy who makes fireworks. Then we see him you know what I mean, stuff like that. Sorry for anyone listening, if you don't know the Lord of the Rings, read it, watch it, do the things, then you can come back to this. But yeah, just reflecting that, I guess, as a theme or as a story that reflects in our world. We see power. We see how power is so often used towards violence. So people who are leaders so often use it toward violence and oppression and domination, as opposed to imagine having power and responsibility, maybe filtering it through love of a neighbor, probably being like, what did Jesus do? Who had all the power and all authority, and who actually said, no, I'm going to lay all of that down, and I'm going to serve, and I'm going to love, and I'm going to talk to the woman at the well and have a conversation and humanize her. You know what I mean? Those kind of things. So it's still a conversation that I'm sitting with, this idea of fantasy worlds, like I was saying a bit in the beginning, fantasy worlds that we escape to, but remaining in our bodies.
Yeah.
There was a little moment that I had maybe a year or so ago, because I was thinking of Lauryn Hill. There's this thing that she says in the beginning of one song, and she said, nah, I don't sing about fantasy anymore. I sing about reality. I've retired from the fantasy part. And then the audience, you hear, woo, they cheer. They're like, yeah, retire from fantasy. I'm singing about reality. But I'm wondering, like, are those things two binaries, fantasy and reality? Are they actually binaries, or is there actually a liminal space we can exist in that's in between those two things? For example, your story of being in the Catholic Church there, being like, the space that I'm in is actually just showing me death. But then looking in that space and being like, oh my gosh, there's actually something else here. Perhaps even if you hadn't met that woman and had the conversation with her and noticed, oh, you're pregnant, perhaps someone else could be in that space and just leave there and be like, this world sucks, humans suck, we all suck, we're just evil, we have no capacity for good. In that moment, you saw that beautiful image and had that conversation, and you saw, oh my gosh, there's actually life, there's actually hope, you know. So yeah, that's one thing that I think perhaps fantasy does. It can expand our minds. It also opens up new possibilities that don't just exist on pages of a Tolkien map or a made-up language, but possibilities that we can actually see and realize in our world.
What I've learned over the years is that I actually forgot how to play. So as a grown-up, one of the healing journeys for me has been to get in touch with my inner child, because she couldn't play because of the trauma that I grew up in. And so I needed to give her space to play. So I have started rock painting. This year I did contemporary dancing. It wasn't great for my knees. Next year I want to try karate because, I'm wanting to play physically. That is for me the beauty of fantasy, is that what it does is it takes you into a place where anything is possible. Because basically in the stories that we read, with magic, things can happen that are just amazing. Whether it's Lord of the Rings or the Dune series, there's this thing about imagining a different world. If we don't have fantasy genres, where do we play? Where do we get an opportunity to just be able to sit quietly and allow our minds to go to incredible places? C.S. Lewis's The Narnia Chronicles. Where do we get the chance to step through the wardrobe into Narnia and just dream about a world where things work differently? And so through imagination, we get to access, this is how it could be. If we don't have fantasy genres, where do we play? Where do we get an opportunity to just be able to sit quietly and allow our minds to go to incredible places? C.S. Lewis's The Narnia Chronicles. Where do we get the chance to step through the wardrobe into Narnia and just dream about a world where things work differently? And so through imagination, we get to access, this is how it could be. So what is the magic that is in our world that we could harness? I always used to think, where is everybody going to fit? There's the new heaven and the new earth. And everybody that had died since the beginning of time had to live on earth. Where would we all fit? We just wouldn't fit. But in the last book in the Narnia Chronicles, wherever they walked, the land just kept expanding.
Oh, wow.
So it's like there's this infinity of space,
Yeah.
but this beautiful space. I would never even have been able to think about that concept on my own if it hadn't been for the storytelling of C.S. Lewis. When we did the Leadership in Urban Transformation course, one of the things that Stefan had asked us to do was,
Shout out to Stefan de Beer.
yes, to imagine that we are 20 years in the future. And now we are chatting to a reporter, and the reporter is asking us, what has changed in the last 20 years to get you to where we are today? How do you do that if you don't have an imagination? And then how do you even think about translating that picture that you have into actions that can lead you towards that picture?
Yeah.
Imagination, possibilities. If we don't have stories that take us out of our own lives, because our own lives are busy. There's always stuff going on. If it's not with you, then it's with family members or it's with friends. Just for that moment to sit with a book. You're quiet. You're not having conversations with anybody. You're just reading. And the story is taking you somewhere. Where you can just play with ideas in your head. And so I feel that fantasy is vital. It's a vital genre. More people should be reading fiction, because non-fiction can be quite heavy. This is facts. This is researched, you know. There's no, can we play? Can we take paintbrushes and there's a piece of paper and just paint what comes out of you and see where it takes you, you know?
Yeah.
So reading, shout out to reading. We need that space where we can just allow somebody else's words to take us on an adventure.
Isn't part of the beauty of it as well, just as you're speaking, resisting the systems of this world which say, no, you're grown up, you're not allowed to play. Never mind me talking about how am I imagining staying in my body, this, that. Perhaps part of that resistance is saying, actually, for a moment, I'm just going to be in my body and sit and imagine and dream and go into another land. And that's like maybe that toxic with hustle culture and stuff. It's like a resistance against that as well.
The idea that hustle culture will lead to human flourishing is maybe a bit flawed compared to the possibilities that imagination can unlock. So what I'm thinking about as you both are talking is about like how entering the space that you're describing, Nicole, which I do think is a liminal space. There is a liminal space. There's the space you go into which is very escapist, purely like you're on the other side of this thing, you're imagining, you're dreaming, whatever. And then there's reality, and then there's a space in between where you're making sense of almost these two worlds colliding and intersecting. But you need access to the one, imagination, to come and make a difference here. So I'm thinking about if I'm wearing my coaching hat. In personal transformation, often the questions would be around, imagine yourself in 5 years' time having achieved the goals you've set for yourself, and then describe what that feels like. Like, what do you sense, what do you note, or whatever. And it's incredible to see what that unlocks for people. Like, you have to take that step of going into the unknown mystery imagination thing. Because then you are out of your current situation, which is what you're saying. You're actually out of your current situation. And then you can think about, okay, cool. If that's the case, then how do we get there? Let's like talk about what are the action steps.
Yes.
Then you can invent the future.
Then you can invent the future. You can, let's shout out to Dylan, who talks about sneaking up on your future. You're sneaking up on your future.
I like that.
So I was trying to find this quote that I can't find. That's by a Palestinian professor and poet and philosopher called Professor Rafat Al-Aria, who was killed last year in Gaza. And he has this interesting work about story and telling the story of Gaza. So what I was able to find was an abstract from a paper. There's a book called Gaza Writes Back. And this is an essay. And the abstract of it, I thought, kind of summarizes some of what we're speaking about. So I'll read it. In Palestine, stories are sacred. In trying times, we turn to storytelling for solace. Mothers and grandmothers are the major source of stories in the families. And just when you are old enough, you realize that you have been shaped by these stories and that they go far beyond entertainment. As a Palestinian, I have been brought up on stories, and I learned early in my life that it's both selfish and treacherous to keep a story to myself. If I allowed a story to stop, I would be betraying my legacy, my mother, my grandmother, and my homeland. There's an interesting quote in terms of the interplay between where you go with stories that are fantastical versus this very real thing that you are dealing with.
I think the other reason why new stories and imagination is important is because present stories and imagination exist already. I know that may seem like an obvious thing, but the world as it currently exists, that was imagined by someone.
Yeah.
That was imagined by forces and systems, and
Yes.
even like the fact that we have the continent of Africa that's been divided up the way it's been divided up, that was imagined by a few white men around the table who said, nah, Belgium, nah, we'll take that. We'll take DRC. Okay, now we'll split it by the river. The city that we live in, we were talking nonchalantly in the beginning about what side of the rail track are we? Are we upper, okay,
Lower Berkeley to upper
lower,
Eastfield.
yeah, not that those are things, but we just
Yes.
like teasing. And it's because also the city was imagined in a certain way. So I think when we're talking about imagination, it's also that idea of reimagination. So
Yes.
we're reimagining, not necessarily that it means that we've been given a chance to imagine things in the past. Sometimes none of us have even been given permission to actually imagine and design and create a better world and a better city and all of those kind of things. But perhaps part of the reimagining aspect of it is saying, no, this has been imagined by someone. There was that poem I wrote this year. We're still in 2024. This year, the first line was from a conversation with Zach, actually. You also know Zach. And it was just about that we cannot be fully human in someone else's imagination. So that idea of like, even on this world, I can't actually be fully human. And why can I not belong? Why can I not find belonging and flourishing and existence? Because someone else has imagined this thing. So what the goal and what the beauty of, even if you want to bring it back to Christianity, talk about the kingdom, shalom, those kind of things, part of that is reimagining a new world where we can belong, where people who have been marginalized or oppressed can exist and flourish,
Yeah.
What about in kind of that theme, Nicole, you speak about, well, I'm going to call it something, but you might disagree with me, but like reimagining our perceptions of God.
Yeah.
So you've been on this journey of the sacred feminine and what that means. I don't fully understand all of that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like in this conversation, that is actually also what that is. It's a reimagining our perception of God, or what we've been told God is like. And I wondered if you maybe want to just do like a brief description on what is the sacred feminine.
Okay.
And then what does it open up then? What does that kind of thinking open up as possibilities?
I don't know if I'd be able to give an academic definition of the sacred feminine, but maybe I can describe it by telling the story of my journey of the sacred feminine. So my dad died in 2019, and I was traumatized because I'd taken responsibility for my dad's death. And when I imagined, when I closed my eyes and I pictured what would comfort me, I thought of Octavia Spencer in the book, in the movie production of the book, The Shack. And she was this black woman. She was solid, and she had these huge arms. And that image of God looking like that. And in the movie, she is God in our minds we say she's God the Father, in the Trinity. She's God the Father. Then Jesus looks just like he fell out of the plane from the Middle East. He looks completely, Middle Eastern. And then the Holy Spirit is represented by an Asian woman with long black hair. So when I closed my eyes and I thought of the image and I felt within my body what made me exhale and what made me lean into and what made me feel comforted and held. God was a black woman. And then I started reading. Now, this is probably the weirdness of Google that many of us don't know, that when you speak around your phone, suddenly when you go onto Instagram, you get these ads that come up that are what you were talking about but didn't even type in as a Google search.
Interesting.
Yeah, I know. Freaks me out. Okay. But suddenly stuff started popping up in Facebook and and Instagram that was starting to get me to think about God as a woman. And so I had somewhere obviously read the term divine feminine or sacred feminine, and then I did a Google search. And it took me down a rabbit hole that seriously blew my mind. So it's like witches and covens and Wicca and cultic spirituality and Hindu goddesses. And it was just like, no, I don't know if I feel comfortable, because I kind of still like Jesus. And because I identify as a Christ follower and was raised within the Christian religion, I was like, but now I need to find something that speaks a little bit of the language that makes sense to me in terms of faith and spirituality. And oh my word, the amount of stuff that I found. So it's been 5 years. So what I have learned about the sacred feminine is that one aspect of it is the language around God, where within the Christian religion, all language about God is male. All characteristics about God that is spoken about more is masculine characteristics. God is warrior, God is king. I was filling the water in the fridge and I was singing the song Ek is nie 'n stapsoldaatjie nie, 'n reissoldaatjie nie, 'n vliegsoldaatjie nie. So even in the language of the Christian faith, we're part of the Christian army. Right? So it's very like warlike, very warlike.
Yeah, there's a lot of militarism.
But as I started diving into and reading about the sacred feminine, whether it was from a Christian perspective or whether it was from other faith perspectives, because there's a sacred feminine in Islam, there's sacred feminine conversations in Judaism. It's amazing. There are books where all these voices are sort of, contributing to their understanding of how the sacred feminine plays itself out within their faith traditions and understandings. What I'm sensing more as I'm allowing all of that stuff to settle is that it's less about, but not less important. It's another aspect of. So God is male and God is also female, but it's not about sex. It's not about gender. It's about a philosophy. It is about an essence. And I don't know how it came about, but I think it's probably philosophical language. There's a masculine essence and there's a feminine essence in the world. And what people are starting to, outside of Christianity, David Corton is an example. They are starting to recognize that there are masculine characteristics, and those characteristics have been allowed to dominate in our world. Those are the characteristics that have shaped our systems politically, economically, and socially. What is missing and what is needed to bring about a balance is the feminine side. And feminine characteristics, it's not about classifying masculine and feminine characteristics as good or bad. It's balancing forces. And so masculine characteristics can present itself in a way that is unhelpful and destructive, and in other ways it is energy building and positive, and it's the same with feminine characteristics. So people downplay feminine characteristics because it's softness, it's weakness, it's too emotional, but there is merit in feminine characteristics if it comes in a positive form, in the form of compassion, in the form of community building and community making. It comes with recognizing that as a human being, we are not only cognitive, intellectual human beings, but it brings about and acknowledges the sanctity of the flesh, the sanctity of the body, where within Western thought, like the Enlightenment philosophical thinking, it elevates the mind. I think, therefore I am. Yeah. Whereas when the feminine comes in, it's because you live, because you be, because you have being in the world. That's what makes you a human. So you are a body, and you experience emotions. There's a liberating aspect to assigning gender pronouns to God that then elevates and restores dignity to a part of the world's population that has been demonized, that has been humanized. So women are either whores or women are Jezebels, they're manipulative. That's how women are seen. They are seen as being deceptive, leading men down the wrong path, with its classic story in Adam and Eve. Within a very, very particular way of reading that story. And then you have all the Greek stories of Cassandra and Pandora. All of these women were all like the Greek gods created women to bother men, to be a thorn in their flesh kind of vibe, and then if you assign a different gender, a different pronoun to God, suddenly there's a part of the population that was never able to see themselves as sacred, to see themselves as holy. Now suddenly they participate and partake of the divine, because God is no longer just one-sided. And so the sacred feminine is not about converting everybody into becoming witches and filling their homes with cauldrons and dried herbs and all of those things. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a particular understanding of what embracing the sacred feminine is. What I'm starting to settle into is an understanding that there are human beings whose dignity was taken away from because we've narrowed our understanding of who God is. And I'm saying, can we expand our understanding of God? Yes, we are changing it, but we're not saying, no, now we're no longer allowed to use male pronouns. No. We want to broaden it. We want to make it expansive so that it includes everybody. And that's what the sacred feminine is challenging the world to do. It's saying, that's not the only way to do the world. There is another way. There's a way that honors nature. That's very big in the sacred feminine. There's a huge ecological like a resurgence in the sanctity of ecology. And there's more than just the systems that we have. Like Rash said, the systems that we had came out of the imaginations of a particular kind of thinking. Now let's expand it. Can we acknowledge that maybe it's run its course?
Yeah.
It's actually shown that if we continue on this path, it's actually going to lead to total destruction. Yeah. So what if we include that which has always existed but has never been acknowledged? And that is the essence, the principles, and the philosophies of the sacred feminine.
That's brilliant.
It's brilliant.
Me as, someone who's like a man, a man and all of the above, it's weird, I've never been, I know this may sound weird to say it like this, but I've never been very interested in the masculine kind of vibes, just in how I operate in the world, I don't know. And I've always, in a way, maybe it's because I mainly grew up with my mom who raised us, but I've always been intrigued by the fact that there's a beauty in, even as a man, maybe some of the things you described that would be the softer side of things, or compassion or love and those kind of things. And I've never viewed those things as a threat to my masculinity. I'm always like, no, that's a vibe. That's beautiful and it's amazing. And there's this like version of masculinity. I guess the world has now described it rightly so as toxic masculinity. And yeah, I don't know. It's maybe a conversation that men must have amongst ourselves. Hey Tristan, about like why are we afraid to open up to the possibilities that we can be feminine, or that there's lessons to be learned and wisdom to be carried. I wonder if it's also just like an external thing, like if it's like, okay, woman, you do you, or if it's also a thing that we can also embody. Like I can actually embody femininity in a beautiful way. The reverse side of that question would be for women to embody masculinity in a beautiful way. So maybe that's a question. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I'm also not sure, but I think maybe some of it I would think also has to do with our underlying belief systems. So bad theology could lead to a bad interpretation of what it means to be a man.
Correct.
For me, the sacred feminine work that opens up the possibilities of being more inclusive of what we think of God, which then does influence how we are in the world.
Yeah. But that's if the God story is one that shapes you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because that's also part of sort of the conversation is, again, going back to the first question you asked is, what are the stories that shape you? And particularly within, and that's why it's the contentious nature of God, the Bible, language can't, the connotations of words, what is the true meaning of the word? All of that is held within the stories that we hold. The stories that shape us consciously and unconsciously.
Yeah, a lot is unconscious.
Which is why, I don't know if his name was James Field, he speaks about an unreflective life is no life at all. If you don't actually take the time to stop and think about, but what is the story that shapes me? I use a model that was, I don't know if N.T. Wright created this model, but it comes up in one of his books. For those of you who know N.T. Wright and his book Big Red. So in there he speaks about this concept of the worldview, the lenses that you spoke about earlier, like the lenses that we wear that enable us to interpret what we read or what we see in the world. So he's got an understanding of a worldview that it is stories that answer the questions of who am I, where am I, what is wrong with the world, and what is the solution to the world. And those stories are then placed in symbols, whether the symbols be a sign like the cross, or a festival like the color festival that the Hindus, like that. Like that festival tells a particular story. And so some people just go because they love throwing paint at each other, but they don't actually understand what the underlying, significance of it is. And then all of that plays itself out in what the word praxis, how we live out in the world. And I've always looked at that diagram and I've always thought, because a lot of people don't actually think about their lives, think about how did they get here, think about what is their story, even their life story. Their praxis actually tells me what their story is. So I can look at how you live, I can look at how you treat people, I can look at how you treat animals and plants, and whether you recycle or whether you don't recycle, whether you drink water that comes out of the tap or you only drink Woolworths water. I can tell what your story is, possibly, because of the choices that you make on how you live. And that's one of the things that I was challenged by deeply when I started my theological studies, was recognizing that how I view the world is actually because I have a worldview. I have a lens. And I wear that lens, for better, for worse, consciously or unconsciously. And so when I, for example, come up against an idea and it rattles me badly, the lecturer who taught us that said that's an indication that your worldview is being challenged. And you don't even realize it, that it's being challenged. I sat in a conversation where we were doing an imagination game. This one person said the only way that South Africa is going to be able to heal itself or fix itself is if everybody commits class suicide. And I remembered just this heat coming into my face. I was feeling flushed and I was feeling flustered and agitated. And I wanted to, sit with the person and say, what do you mean? But is that really going to work? Because if, and I could think of all these objections. And then I went home and I was like, why did that upset me so much? And then I was like, oh, possibly because I wear a middle-class worldview. And I don't always recognize that I carry that worldview. And I don't want to give up my privileges. I don't want to commit suicide because then I lose my privileges. But then what does that mean? What does that say about me? What does that say about the story that I tell about the world? So we can have a conversation around stories. But I also want to invite people just to think about even your own life story. Even if you just start there. Have you thought about your life story? Have you thought about what shapes you as a person today? How did you get to where you are today? And is that the only story you need to live by?
Yeah, how you've been socialized, and is there harm in that socialization, and how can you
and
move
is
away
there
from
maybe
it?
Another story?
Exactly, and choose something better.
Well, thank you, Nicole. This has been
Nicole.
insightful and a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure being here in this conversation with you.
All right, fun.